Let's see now, America is doing things, India is doing things. I don't think there should be a war. We think we are in the safe hands because we are in constant touch with the embassy.
Hello and welcome to Gravitas Ukraine Direct. I'm Palki, Sharma, Upadhyay, coming to you live from Kyiv. We've been here for 7 days now, and each day comes with new worries. On Wednesday, Russia deployed 6 warships to the Black Sea. Today, it has started joint military exercises with Belarus. Troops, fighter jets, missile systems, they've all moved closer to Ukraine's border. They will conduct drills here for the next 10 days. Remember, this is happening barely 130 miles from where I'm standing. That's a roughly 3-hour drive, but for missiles it'll take much less time. But despite this looming threat, the residents of Kyiv seem determined to not let fear win. And this is also true for Indian students in this country. 20,000 of them live in Ukraine, most of them studying medicine and engineering. How worried are they about the Russian buildup? We decided to find out. Earlier today, we visited the Taras Shevchenko National University, one of Ukraine's foremost institutions for medical science. When I spoke to the Indian students studying there, I asked them about their life under the spectre of war. Here's what they told me. It's a make-or-break moment in the Ukraine conflict. Russia's 10-day-long military exercise with Belarus has kicked off. Russian forces have surrounded Ukraine from all sides. The US is asking its citizens to leave. Ukraine is resolute and tense. It's a testing time for its people. Also for the 20,000-odd Indian students who live in this country. Indians form the biggest foreign student group in Ukraine. Most of them come here to study medicine. Why Ukraine? A, because it's affordable. The cost of medical education here is cheaper than it is in India. And B, the degrees that they get are recognized both in Europe and in India. So the students come here in large numbers. About 2 weeks back, the Indian embassy in Kyiv drew up a list. It asked these students to fill up forms and collated their information in case they have to be evacuated, in case war breaks out. But what do the students here feel? Do they believe that there will be war? Are they tense? We decided to find out. This is the Taras Shevchenko National University, one of the premier institutions for medical science in Ukraine, also home to a number of Indian students. As war brews on the border, life in the dormitories is exactly how you would expect. There are reading rooms where students catch up after class, a shared kitchen where they try to fix an Indian meal, and Bollywood music that dissolves some of the tension in the air. On the face of it, life looks normal on campus, but the threat of war weighs on the minds of these students.
These are things that happen in one night. And you don't even know when people, and these military of Russian military enters Ukraine and does all the chaos. But all we are doing is just waiting for the updates and waiting for Feb 11th. That's it.
They worry, not just for their own safety, but also that of their Ukrainian friends.
If there is a war or if there is some kind of disaster happening, we have a place to go back and create our own life back in India. We have an option to go back and make our future brighter, or somehow we can manage. I understand we are from the many people who are here are of the middle class or the lower middle class or of poor people who are coming here and studying. For all of us it will be a big hit if such issues happen. But we have an option to go back and create our life back in India. But whereas my Ukrainian friends and fellow mates, they are going to lose their independence. That's what we feel sad about. Not only me, that's what we all feel sad about our Ukrainian friends and Ukrainian citizenship. Losing freedom and independence is worse than anything else.
Madhu is a 4th-year student. The MBBS course is about 6 years long. That's good enough time to get used to a conflict. But this time, it's serious. They're concerned about the scale of the Russian buildup.
I've been here for the past 3 years and there's always been talk of war going on.
But till now, I don't think it's the same thing. But this time it was more serious than before, obviously. Let's see now. America is doing things, India is doing things. I don't think there should be a war. But, well, you know, Russia, there's Putin, so you can't say anything. But
These students are banking on the Indian embassy in Kyiv. They've been evacuated once before. At the beginning of the pandemic, hundreds of students were flown back to India through the Vande Bharat mission. They say if war breaks out, New Delhi will ensure their safety.
We don't know how they are going to deal it politically, but right now when it comes to us, we think we are in the safe hands because we are in constant touch with the embassy. And if there is any kind of evacuation or something, the embassy is going to take measures accordingly, and they're going to do the best whatever they feel like. Yeah.
Until then, the Indian students are lying low. A surge in Wuhan virus cases has moved classes online. A lot of their classmates have gone back home. Those who are here say they know how to stay out of trouble.
We don't go to the borders or we don't travel much. We stay low-key in our hostel premises or near the university because we are near to the Boris spill, and if anything conflicts, in case it happens, for evacuation or all, it will be easy. So we are just avoiding to go far away from the city.
The pandemic has already disrupted their education. A war would deal a body blow to it. As Russian troops fire missiles, the echoes of their war games ring through the corridors of these colleges.
Most of our parents from India tell us stories about their, childhood and everything, that they'd been doing this and that through the hardships and going to school. So we have our set of stories, that we studied in Ukraine and there was a big war going on.
These young Indian students are writing their stories in a dangerous setting in Ukraine. Here's hoping they find a happy ending. With the WION team in Kyiv, this is Palki Sharma Upadhyay. The week of diplomacy is ending with fireworks, and not the good kind. Russia and Belarus have kicked off their joint military drill, 10 days of non-stop training. We're talking about lethal firepower here. Around 30,000 troops, 2 battalions of the S-400 missiles, Su-35 fighter jets and nuclear-capable Iskander missiles. Simply put, it's the biggest European deployment since the Cold War. The pictures are flattering. It's winter season here, so the training grounds are covered in snow. You've got tanks rolling in formation, you've got fighter jets zooming through the skies. It looks good on your television, but I'll tell you what, it's unnerving here in Kyiv. These drills are happening near the Belarus-Ukraine border. It's a short hop from where I'm standing, around 200 kilometers, that's all. There's a highway running down from the border to Kyiv. So these 10 days are going to be crucial. NATO says these military drills are a ruse, that the real plan is to invade Ukraine. So Kyiv is not taking any chances. They are staging military drills of their own. And the timetable, is the same as Russia's. 10 days. Now, we don't know how many Ukrainian soldiers are involved in this drill, but the firepower is impressive. We've got Bayraktar drones and anti-tank Javelin missiles on display. The difference is Russia has a 100% committed partner, Belarus. You see, these drills demonstrate two things. One, Russia's military might, and two, Russia's control over Belarus. A couple of years back, this was not the case. When Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, Belarus did not recognize the move. It was only in 2021 that Lukashenko made a U-turn. So what has changed now? His position in Belarus. Lukashenko needed Putin's help to crush the anti-government protests. Since then, they're best friends. What about Ukraine's friends? All talk and little action. Their major concern is their own economy, specifically their energy needs. The import of Russian gas has slowed down in the last few days. Shipments at the European entry point in Slovakia have dropped 40%. So gas prices are climbing in Europe. Europe may say its priority is to prevent a war, but their actual priority is to protect their gas imports, which explains why they are pushing for talks. One round of talks happened today in Berlin. They're called the Normandy talks. This is the Normandy format. These talks include 4 nations: Russia, Ukraine, Germany and France. Why is it called the Normandy format? Because it was first pitched during a meeting in Normandy in France. And what do these talks cover? The insurgency in eastern Ukraine. You've got the government on one side and pro-Russian separatists on the other. So far, around 14,000 people have died in this war in eastern Ukraine. Is a resolution then possible? If you ask Russia or Europe, they have one answer. The Minsk Agreement signed in 2015. They make it seem like a one-stop solution. So what's in this agreement? 5 major things. Number 1, an immediate ceasefire. Number 2, a withdrawal of heavy weaponry. Number 3, a dialogue to hold elections in this region. Number 4, Kyiv regains control of the Russian border. And number 5, all foreign fighters withdraw. Now, President Zelensky of Ukraine is not a fan of this agreement. And you can understand why this is the case. The separatists are backed by Russia. Their weapons, their funds, everything comes from Moscow. Yet Russia says they're not bound by this agreement. In fact, the word Russia is not even a part of the text. So Zelensky wants to reboot the talks. He has drawn a few red lines himself. Most of them boil down to one idea: no compromise on Ukraine's sovereignty. And this has put most of Europe in a tough spot. They want a quick resolution. At the same time, they cannot openly abandon Ukraine. The result is a strange strategy in Europe. Take Britain, for instance. Prime Minister Boris Johnson was in Brussels today. He visited the NATO headquarters and he talked tough on Russia. But his foreign secretary was in Moscow. A few hours back, she held a press conference with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Now, I know Moscow is cold, but even by those standards, this presser was chilling.
I'm honestly disappointed that what we have is a conversation between a dumb and a deaf person. It seems like we listen but don't hear. At least our most detailed explanations fell on unprepared soil. They say Russia is waiting until the ground freezes like a stone, so its tanks can easily cross into Ukrainian territory. I think the ground was like that today with our British colleagues, from which numerous facts that we produced bounced off.
India too finds itself in a bind. So far, New Delhi has refused to pick sides in this battle. But Russia's ambassador in New Delhi is sending out feelers. He says that Russia is India's most important defense partner and that Moscow is not just selling weapons, but also transferring technology. He added that Russia was not looking to mediate between India and China, interestingly. Now, is this an assurance or is it a nudge? Depends on which way you look at it. If the West imposes sanctions, Russia is going to turn to India to sell their weapons, to also sell their natural gas. So these 10 days won't be tough just for Europe. They'll be tough for the whole world. Our hopes are still pinned on diplomacy. But as this week comes to a close, we've seen very little progress on that front. Emmanuel Macron's Moscow mission was a misfire. So was Britain's mission today. So the room for diplomacy is shrinking. Military drills have begun once again. Evacuation plans have been approved. There's no consensus, no compromise, and no commitments. So where exactly are things headed now? Is war inevitable in Ukraine? To discuss this and more, I'm being joined by our correspondents from 4 capitals that are shaping this conflict. Julia Chapman with us from Moscow, Nick Harper from Washington, D.C., Laura Makin-Isherwood from London, and Ollie Barrett from Brussels. Hello to all of you from Kyiv. Julia, we'll start with you. Russia and Belarus have commenced joint military exercises. What can you tell us about these drills?
Well, as you've said, these are very substantial drills with many Russian troops taking part of them in them, upwards of 30,000 by some estimates, a very strong contingent of the Russian military, the largest in Belarus since the end of the Cold War, when, of course, these were all one country under the Soviet Union. So certainly there are concerns about the numbers of troops taking part in these drills. They compare with those that took place last year, where there were joint exercises between Russia and Belarus. This is about 3 times the size of that Russian military contingent. The Russian military, the Russian Ministry of Defense says that these are simply preparatory exercises. They will be simulating a possible attack against Belarus, and these are not an offensive set of drills. But certainly there are concerns in the West that the capabilities being built up in Belarus right now could also pose a threat to Ukraine.
Nick, Joe Biden has approved a plan to get Americans out of Ukraine in case of an invasion. And he's also received a phone call from the French president last night. Tell us about the developments in Washington, D.C.
Well, that's right. The White House approving that Pentagon-driven plan. This is all about the US troops that have been sent over to Poland. They will be helping American citizens who want to leave Ukraine. Now, under the rules, they can't enter Ukraine itself. Instead, they'll be based in neighbouring Poland. That's where they'll remain. But they're going to set up border checkpoints on the Poland-Ukraine border, as well as temporary housing. So any American citizens who are trying to flee Ukraine and leave via those border posts will get the assistance of those US troops. We're told about 1,700 US troops have left the United States heading to Poland, and they will be stationed there in that support capacity, providing logistics. The White House and the Pentagon making it clear that this will not be an evacuation operation. They don't plan to go to Ukraine to try and fly out any American citizens who are there. And the US president has spoken to his French counterpart as well, part of those ongoing efforts for the US to remain connected to Europe. There are also suggestions that the US president may on Friday hold a phone call with leaders of various European nations and NATO, all part of that united front, trying to show that they have the similar message, the same way forward to try and counter that Russian aggression.
Laura, the United Kingdom is readying about 1,000 troops for humanitarian support if Ukraine is invaded. Tell us about the threat perception in London.
Well, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that if this is a dangerous moment and that it would be an absolute disaster if Russia did invade Ukraine. The Prime Minister has been in Brussels this morning speaking with the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, the Alliance's Secretary General. They had around a 35-minute conversation there this morning discussing the situation. Of course, the UK has now pledged to put a further 1,000 troops on standby to be there in support should a humanitarian disaster unfold in Ukraine if Russia did invade the country. But of course, this comes at the same time that the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, has headed to Moscow for talks with her counterpart there, Sergei Lavrov. They've been in talks there. It's understood that the Russian Foreign Minister has said that it's essentially the West escalating tensions, that the West is not listening to Russia and their requests for troops to be moved away from Eastern Europe. The West, however, the UK and other allies in NATO are standing firm.
Ollie, as Laura pointed out, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has landed in Brussels and he'll be visiting Poland, he'll go to Lithuania and then Germany next. Tell us what he's up to.
Yeah, he's left Brussels actually. He was here earlier today having those talks with Jens Stoltenberg to say that Britain stands behind the military alliance and is able to offer more support to it if needed. The trip to Poland is part of the process really to try and show that the UK is able to show support to some of its allies in the Eastern European region, some of those countries particularly that border Ukraine. The UK and Poland, their relations have actually been getting very much stronger in recent years, and again this is a demonstration, London believes, of that close relationship between the UK and Poland. Boris Johnson will also visit some of the British troops already stationed inside Poland, and on the same day that his Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is in Moscow, this is all part of the attempts from London to show that it can show support militarily in a humanitarian way if it's required, but also trying to further put the squeeze on Moscow. And we do expect that in London today legislation will be put forward to Parliament which would allow the UK to strengthen the sanctions that it might be able to level against Moscow in the event of an invasion.
Laura, Nick, Ollie, Julia, thanks very much for bringing us those updates. You've heard from the capitals. Now let's head to the War Office. What is the numbers game on the ground here? If Putin wants to invade, how would his generals do it? Well, like any good general, it's time to pull up a map. We keep saying Ukraine is surrounded. This map tells you how it's surrounded. On the north, you have Belarus. Around 30,000 Russian troops are stationed there. They've got S-400 missiles, nuclear bombers and fighter jets. To the south, you have the Black Sea. 6 Russian warships have dropped anchor here. They will soon begin military drills of their own. Their home base is this legendary port, the port of Sevastopol. No stranger to wars. During the Second World War, this port withstood bombing by the Germans. It's getting battle ready again. Finally, to the east, you have the separatist zone. Around 15,000 pro-Russian insurgents are camping here. Beyond them is the Russian border. And this is where the big numbers are deployed, around 100,000 Russian soldiers ready and waiting for orders. They've got armored vehicles, they've got tanks, artillery guns, even field hospitals and blood supplies. Now you've seen the map, but what about strategies? How would a war play out? Most experts are talking about 4 possible scenarios. Number 1 is an all-out invasion, in which case all 3 flanks would see action. Troops would move in from Belarus, warships would engage from the south. But the serious fighting will most likely happen in eastern Ukraine. And this scenario would be a bloodbath, we can tell you. Scenario number 2, annexation of Donbass. This strategy may excite Putin for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's a face saver for him. And number 2, the cost is going to be relatively less. There is popular support for a Russian annexation of Donbass. Think of it as Crimea 2.0. There will be sanctions, yes, and no official recognition. Having said that, a lot depends on Volodymyr Zelensky. He is determined to defend every inch of Ukraine, in which case regions don't really matter, Kyiv or Donbass. Zelensky will have to fight the Russians. Scenario number 3, a tactical victory. Attack, destroy and leave. This is another face-saving option for Vladimir Putin. He doesn't have to take Kyiv. He can just inflict some damage and then retreat. Putin did that to Georgia in 2008, remember. He could try it again. But 2 things will make him rethink. Number 1, Ukraine's army is more lethal than Georgia's. And number 2, the attack in 2008 did not temper Georgia's pro-Western tilt. So if Putin attacks this time, he could push Ukraine further towards NATO. Scenario number 4, unconventional attack. This could mean cyber warfare, something that Russia has invested millions on already. Russian hackers could shut off the internet or target security establishments in Ukraine. There would be sanctions, but no losses really. Another option is to step up insurgency in eastern Ukraine, deploy more foreign fighters, train more insurgents, give them more weapons. Again, in this scenario, Putin can cut his losses. Of course, there is a 5th option. Diplomacy shines through. The West and Russia reach some sort of a deal, and Russian troops withdraw from the border. Well, this may look like the perfect scenario, but it's extremely challenging. For instance, 7 months from now, we could be back to square one. More build-ups, more shuttle diplomacy. The problem is this conflict is all about egos. NATO will not let Russia dictate the terms, and Russia will not let NATO dictate either. And even if they reach a compromise, it will cost something valuable: the sovereignty of Ukraine. So how much is that sovereignty at risk? Will a compromise really put an end to this conflict? Or will it make Ukraine more vulnerable in Moscow's eyes? To understand this, I spoke to 2 individuals with a deep understanding of Ukrainian policies and politics. Volodymyr Solohub, he's an independent journalist based here in Kyiv, and Catherine Quinn-Judge, an analyst working for Ukraine at the International Crisis Group. Here's what they told me earlier today. I'll start with you, Catherine. The Russia-Belarus exercises have begun at the border, the 10-day-long exercise. The White House has called this move escalatory, and there are apprehensions that Moscow is going to use this as a pretext or as an opportunity to start some sort of an incursion. What's your assessment?
Well, my assessment is I can say what I've heard from people who are well placed to know. I do, in fact, have contacts in security, in intelligence, who say that it is likely that an invasion would begin as the Olympics are wrapping up, probably from the north. On the other hand, I think, again, as an analyst, my take is just that it is still incredibly hard to see what Russia could possibly gain in the long run, and how the Putin regime could hope to survive or to maintain its strength if it took such a step.
Volodymyr, do you think that diplomacy is delivering at any level? Today we saw a joint press conference between the foreign ministers of Russia and the UK, and they indulged in what can be best described as a war of words.
Well, diplomacy is actually the only thing which the entire world is hoping that can deter Russian President Putin. Obviously, Ukraine cannot face off Russia militarily. It's much smaller, much weaker army, even though it is very prepared to defend its borders. And obviously, nobody else will send their troops here to Ukraine to fight with Russia. So right now, diplomacy is our only option.
We hear daily headlines of the kind of military and financial support that Ukraine's partners are offering it. Do you think that the Ukrainian forces stand a chance in case of a Russian invasion with all of the support that they're getting from their allies?
No, I don't think that they stand a chance. And I think that, in fact, I would go further and say that some of this talk of, talking up how prepared the Ukrainians are to defend themselves and sort of what a noble battle they'll wage, while in some cases well-intentioned, is also potentially misleading, in that there is no way that Ukraine could come out of this well. You could even argue that some of the military support that Ukraine is getting could simply end up prolonging whatever misery could arise from an invasion. So no, there's no way this goes well for Ukraine. So I just want to reiterate what my colleague said, that diplomacy it's the only option, right?
And when you talk about diplomacy, I think the Europeans are once again pushing a lot for the Minsk Accord. But we know that the Minsk Accord has not been able to deliver peace. Can we still call it the best bet at peace?
Well, I think this is the only option to which Russia has signed, and which Russia has agreed to fulfill. Unfortunately, Russia is not doing their part on the Minsk agreements. If we have a new deal, if we have another deal, that's another question. But this is the only thing which we have to work with right now, and that's what the diplomats are trying to get their best out of at this stage.
Would you say, given all of this, the way talks are progressing, Russia is dictating the terms of this negotiation?
Well, Russia is standing firm on what they want, and what they want is to prevent NATO from expanding further to the east, namely to Ukraine, to cut Ukraine any chance in the future to joining NATO. And whatever other promises or whatever other agreements the European Union, the Americans, and the UK are trying to offer Russia, are trying to offer to President Putin, they're not ready to accept these terms.
From how I understand this crisis, I think Europe's first priority is securing its gas supplies. And those are concerns that have been expressed repeatedly by European leaders, including those in France and Germany. Do you fear that if there is a compromise, it would come at Ukraine's expense?
The fact is that I think that whatever happens, whether there's a compromise or whether there isn't a compromise, it's going to hurt Ukraine to some degree. But I would reiterate that seeking a compromise that is in some ways politically disappointing to Ukraine is a lot better than just going straight into war, because diplomacy is considered to be for the weak.
If I may, I would like to add to what my colleague said. We have to understand that Russia's supplies of gas to the European Union is a two-way street. It's not that the European Union is getting this gas for free. If they cut off the gas, Russia will get. They're
not ready to take that risk, it seems.
Russia is ready to. Russia will get cut off from the cash flow, and again, do
you think the Europeans are ready to take that risk?
I don't think they're really ready to take the risk, but at the same time, they understand that Russia also needs their cash.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Catherine Volodymyr. Thanks.
Thank you.
Now, there's something we keep hearing from all European leaders. Putin's security concerns, Putin's safety concerns. What exactly are they? And can the West resolve them? To answer this question, we must go back in history. The year is 1990. The Soviet Union is on its last legs. Washington and Moscow are discussing a crucial European question: the reunification of Germany. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, agrees. But he has one condition: the NATO must not expand eastward. It must not enter Russia's security sphere. The US officials agreed, but the terms were never written down. You could argue this was a mistake. Until a promise is codified, it means nothing really. Having said that, a betrayal is a betrayal, written agreement or not. In the next 2 decades, NATO did exactly that. They adopted an open door policy. What does that mean? That NATO's membership is always open. Any European nation willing to join can do so. There is only one condition: all NATO members must agree on the new member. Since 1991, there have been multiple waves of NATO expansion. The first one was in 1999. Hungary, Poland and the Czech Republic joined the NATO. All three were members of the Warsaw Pact. Now they're all NATO allies. The second wave came in 2004. Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia and Slovenia, all of them joined NATO. Then came the controversial Bucharest summit in 2008. NATO turned its focus on the Western Balkans. Albania and Croatia joined in 2009, Montenegro in 2017, North Macedonia in 2020. 3 countries are considered aspiring members: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Ukraine and Georgia. Now, if you look at this map now, it has changed completely. Before 1991, NATO was confined to Western Europe. Today, it is at Russia's gates. Vladimir Putin is not the only leader to have condemned this expansion. It was criticized by Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin too. The difference is, Putin is drawing a red line, and that red line for him is Ukraine. Does that make him right? Of course not. NATO is not the only one breaking its historical commitments, you see. Yesterday we told you about Ukraine's nuclear arsenal. It was surrendered on one condition, that the world powers would protect Ukraine's sovereignty. And one of those world powers to have signed that agreement was Russia. Both NATO and Russia must ask themselves some serious questions here. For instance, Joe Biden keeps talking about the Pacific pivot. So what's the point of this European obsession? Why bother poking Vladimir Putin? Also, is Ukraine an ideal NATO candidate? We're talking about a former Soviet republic here, a country that has close cultural ties with Russia. Some of their senior commanders also served in the Soviet Union. Why does America want to take this strategic risk? Well, Washington says it doesn't. In 2008, President George Bush opened the door for both Georgia and Ukraine. It's been nearly 14 years. 4 countries have joined the NATO in this time, in these 14 years, but Ukraine and Georgia are still on the waiting list. Why is that? Because European countries are not convinced. The likes of Germany and France, they fear Russian reprisal. So Ukraine became the permanent bridesmaid. But in 2014, Putin again rocked the boat. He invaded and annexed Crimea. Suddenly, the NATO movement was alive again. The current president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, wants to join the alliance as soon as possible. And that's where we stand today. Around 30 years back, America won the Cold War, but they were not satisfied. They wanted to dominate Europe. They wanted to humiliate the Soviet successor state, Russia. Last time around, vague verbal commitments were made by both sides. Nothing was codified or written down. This time around, such rookie mistakes must be avoided. Transparent and open talks, that's what we need this time. Everyone is trying to play peacemaker in this crisis. French President Emmanuel Macron, we've been telling you about him, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, even British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He was in Brussels today. Johnson met NATO Secretary General. He then sent a message to Moscow. He asked Russia to choose between a diplomatic solution and sanctions. The British Prime Minister also told the media that Europe was at its most dangerous moment. What he did not tell was that his own personal position was no different back home. Another bombshell photo has emerged from the Downing Street pandemic parties. This one has Boris Johnson, a bottle of bubbly, a Christmas hat and tinsel. Take a look.
You have already seen this picture. That's the British Prime Minister and his birthday cake. Now take a look at this one. That's Boris Johnson and his bottle of bubbly. The photo surfaced in the middle of a parliament session. The scene could not have been more dramatic. Imagine this. The British Prime Minister is in the House. He has just finished making an announcement about ending COVID restrictions.
Provided the current encouraging trends in the data continue, it is my expectation that we will be able to end the last domestic restrictions, including the legal requirement to self-isolate if you test positive, a full month early, Mr. Speaker.
Johnson is hoping to win over some Tory MPs, and then phones start buzzing. Suddenly, all MPs are looking at their phones. There's a photo of Boris Johnson in yet another pandemic party. He claimed he only briefly attended.
First of all, I'm very sorry about his...
The British Prime Minister is caught lying once again. Here's what happened next.
Mr. Speaker, at the height of the lockdown restrictions in 2020, my constituent, who's worked for the NHS for over 30 years, was diagnosed with a tumour on her spine. Whilst in hospital undergoing painful surgery, her family obeyed the rules and didn't visit her. Mr. Speaker, in the last few minutes, a photo has emerged of the Prime Minister in Downing Street on the 15th of December 2020, surrounded by alcohol, food and people wearing tinsel. It looks a lot like one of the Christmas parties he told us never happened.
I'm afraid he is completely in error.
The photo was taken on the 15th of December 2020. London was in the middle of a lockdown. Social mixing between two or more people from different households was banned. Christmas lunches at work were banned too. And so were Christmas parties. Not too long ago, Johnson told the world he never flouted any of these rules. He also wanted people to believe that the BYOB party was a work event. Or that he never had a birthday bash during lockdown. But photos like these have exposed Johnson's lies. They have damaged the Prime Minister's credentials and given enough and more reasons for Tory MPs to demand Johnson's resignation. If the Prime Minister's former aide, Dominic Cummings, is to be believed, there are more lethal photos than the ones floating around. Currently, the police is investigating 12 parties. They were hosted in Downing Street and the Whitehall. The Christmas quiz had previously not made the cut, but this leaked photo has forced the Met to reconsider. The London police is also preparing to mail out a formal questionnaire to at least 50 people.
My officers have assessed several other events that appear to have taken place at Downing Street and Whitehall.
They will be asked to justify their presence in the rule-breaking parties. Where does all of this leave Boris Johnson? Outside 10 Downing Street. At least that's what critics and the opposition hope.
Speaking of critics and opposition, Justin Trudeau is facing both right now. The Prime Minister of Canada is under tremendous pressure from both truckers and opposition lawmakers to put an end to pandemic restrictions. But Trudeau remains unrelenting. This is despite the fact that the protests have entered the 12th day. They're hurting Canada's economy. Goods worth billions of dollars are stuck at the US-Canada border. The auto industry is bracing itself for disruption and delays, but Justin Trudeau says he's not going to budge. His refusal to talk to the protesters is not only infuriating them further, it's also spurring similar protests in France, Australia and New Zealand. Here's a report.
This is Ottawa, the capital of Canada, and currently a city under siege. For 12 days now, Ottawa streets have been clogged with trucks, rigs and SUVs, all in a bid to get pandemic measures axed. The protesters have pledged to keep going for as long as it takes. They begin protesting in the morning and continue all the way till midnight. So far, 20 arrests have been made, 1,300 tickets have been issued, and 79 criminal probes have been launched. But the movement refuses to die down. The blockade has not only disrupted daily life, but is also proving fatal for Canada's economy. Here's how. Thousands of miles away from Ottawa, the protesters have blocked several key highways which connect Canada with the United States. This includes the Blue Water Bridge in Point Edward and the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor. More than 8,000 trucks, over 40,000 commuters, goods worth $300 million, including $100 million worth of auto parts alone, cross these two bridges every day. Their movement has now come to a halt, disrupting supply chains on both sides. For Canada, this poses a big challenge, as it sends 75% of its goods exports to the United States. Washington too is equally concerned. The White House says the auto industry should brace itself for delays.
We are watching this very closely, and
because, as you kind of touched on here, the Ambassador Bridge is Canada's busiest link to the United States and accounts for about 25% of trade between the two countries. And so the blockade poses a risk to supply chains for the auto industry because the bridge is a key conduit for motor vehicles, components and parts, and delays risk disrupting auto production.
Back in Ottawa, the Canadian Prime Minister is in a fix. He's under pressure not just from the truckers, but also from opposition parties in Parliament. On Wednesday, he faced a flurry of questions from lawmakers who pressed him to lift vaccine mandates.
You need to end it with public health measures. You need to end it.
The shouting grew so loud that Justin Trudeau had to sit down, forcing the House Speaker to come to his rescue.
Mr. Speaker, there are people across this country asking this Prime Minister for clarity, leadership, and hope. People are so frustrated with this Prime Minister that there's protests nationwide.
The kind of support Canadian truckers are receiving has led to similar demonstrations all over the world. In France, a Freedom Convoy has kicked off with the same demands. Lift pandemic restrictions, remove vaccine mandates. Last we checked, the convoy was en route to Paris to build pressure on the Macron government.
I am here to carry the voice of freedom, to try and make it heard that we have had enough. We want to go back to our old lives.
In New Zealand too, a similar movement inspired from the Freedom Convoy has emerged. Protesters have been camping outside the country's parliament for 3 days. The Wellington police is struggling to break them off. New Zealand's Prime Minister says the protests are not a reflection of what the majority feels.
But I'm still reminded that relative to the people that are at Parliament now, on the very day that they're there, tens of thousands of people went out and got vaccinated. It is not reflective of where the rest of New Zealand is at right now. All of us want to actually move on. We're working very hard to put ourselves in the best possible position to do that.
It started from a small town in Canada's British Columbia. It's now slowly becoming a global movement. Does it make it acceptable? For these protesters, it does.
De retrouver notre liberté. Freedom, freedom, freedom.
So Ukraine is surrounded. European leaders continue to jet in and out of the city. We have been here in Kyiv for almost a week now. The pall of tension has not gone away. Like we told you, everyone here is talking about 3 possible scenarios: a full-scale invasion, a limited incursion, or diplomacy winning. A war is not in the interest of any party, but like Margaret Atwood once said, war is what happens when language fails. You and I can hope language and diplomacy prevail this time. For now, it's the end of another show, almost 6:30 p.m. here in Kyiv. You're watching Gravitas Ukraine Direct. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay, coming to you live from the world's most tense capital.